Hi everyone, my name is Lucia Lopez Serrano. I am a lecturer from the Universidad de Salamanca, and today I'm going to read my paper titled Resilient Patterns in Contemporary Canadian Fiction. So, the widespread use of the term resilience in contemporary discourse is closely tied to its ideological entrenchment in the post 2008 financial crisis landscape, and more recently, I argue, to the rise of therapy speak. As Fraile Marcos explains, resilience has evolved from its roots in ecological science into a more flexible narrative tool for individual and systemic endurance, particularly through its absorption into the so called psi disciplines. Both O'Brien and Fraile Marcos note that resilience has been culturally coded as a virtue, even a moral imperative, particularly in narratives that foreground an overcoming of hardship. Butler also expands on this by arguing that resilience is not only a psychological state, but also a narratively mediated cultural practice. Literature, therefore, offers a privileged space to examine how resilience is imagined, constructed, and contested. So, this paper explores how contemporary Canadian fiction reflects, reworks, and resists dominant understandings of resilience. It focuses on texts by Miriam Tapes, Jean Christophe Réel, Lee Maracle, and Tracy Lindbergh, and Thomas King, sorry, which offer alternative models of endurance rooted in cultural memory, ecological entanglement, and collective care. Drawing on theoretical frameworks by Fraile Marcos, O'Brien, Bachelet, and Unger, I argue that these authors challenge neoliberal appropriations of resilience by reframing it as a situated and often conflicted process, one that unfolds not within isolated individuals, but through relationships, landscapes, and cultural continuities. So, the neoliberal turn in health and self help discourse has increasingly positioned resilience as a moral obligation. In this framework, to be resilient is to self regulate, adapt, and optimize performance in the face of adversity. This notion of bouncing back, coined by Sarah Bracke, permeates not only mental health advice, but also broader narratives about success, productivity, and citizenships. As Braque observes, resilience has become a central term in a regime that celebrates self reliance while quietly dismantling collective safety nets. Literary narratives, particularly illness narratives, have become key sites for both the reinforcement and the critique of this paradigm. Basler outlines how popular restitution narratives often mirror the expectations of resilience discourse, like plotting a trajectory from suffering to recovery with a coherent identity and meaning restored by the end. Yet, I found many Canadian texts that resist this arc. Instead, they explore what O'Brien terms compromised resilience, a mode of endurance that is shaped by systemic injustice, ecological precarity, and international trauma. Indeed, contemporary Canadian literature provides fertile ground for these critical interrogations. As Hamel and Brydon have noted, Canadian literature has expanded beyond the question of national identity to embrace a plurality of perspectives that engage with both local and global pressures. Fraile Marcos describes such works as glocal narratives in which personal and collective crises are intertwined with broader ecological, political, and historical forces. The country's settler colonial history, multicultural self image, and fraught relationships with land and governance make Canadian fiction a vital site for rethinking resilience. This is particularly evident in Indigenous literature, which has often been co opted into the nation's therapeutic narrative of reconciliation. Um, O'Brien, for instance, in her reading of Thomas King's The Back of the Turtle, unpacks how official discourses instrumentalize Indigenous storytelling, um, as a tool for national healing, often divorcing stories from their community specific land based epistemologies. King's novel, however, reclaims storytelling as a practice of decolonial resilience, foregrounding indigenous sovereignty, planetary justice, and relational ethics over individualist recovery. This novel contrasts two models of resilience, according to O'Brien, one embedded in corporate damage control and settler multiculturalism, and another grounded in indigenous cosmology and relational ethics. The novel centers on Gabriel Quinn, an indigenous scientist responsible for an environmental catastrophe who returns to his mother's ancestral land to reckon with his guilt. The narrative unfolds in the aftermath of the disaster known as the Ruin, weaving together Gabriel's tentative reconnection with community, the resurgence of natural life, and the retelling of the Sky Woman creation story. In O'Brien's reading, the novel critiques the commodification of resilience by settler institutions, which valorize indigenous stories only insofar as they contribute to a multicultural narrative of national strength. In contrast, King's storytelling emphasizes place thought, a worldview in which land is sentient and knowledge emerges from relationships with more than human beings. Here, storytelling is not merely a therapeutic device, but a form of material engagement with place, community, and memory. Gabriel's reluctant participation in retelling the Sky Woman's story marks a turning point in his journey, not of redemption in the individualist sense, but of re embedding himself with a damaged yet living network of kinship. In the works of Lee Maracle, particularly Raven's Song and Celia's Song, resilience is defined through indigenous sovereignty, community resurgence, and environmental stewardship. Maracle is critical of the state's attempt to fold indigenous suffering into reconciliatory narratives that leave structures of power untouched. Her characters grapple with the ongoing effects of colonialism, including displacement, environmental degradation, and lateral violence, and search for ways to heal that do not rely on state recognition or biomedical intervention. Miracle thus envisions resilience as inherently tied to resurgence, a process not of assimilation or survival within the settler state, but of rebuilding indigenous knowledge systems and governance on their own terms. In Celia's song, the practice of storytelling, dreaming, and collective ceremony forms a healing narrative that counteracts what Markle calls bad medicines. Her work resonates with Simpson's call for the colonial practices rooted in land based responsibilities and non hierarchical relationality. If King critiques settler multiculturalism's appropriation of resilience, Miriam Taves exposes its medicalized variant. In All My Puny Sorrows, Taves tells the semi autobiographical story of two sisters, Elfrieda, a gifted pianist battling chronic depression, and Yolandi, the narrator who struggles to understand and accept Elfrieda's wish to die. Throughout the novel, healthcare professionals frame Alfreda's suicidal ideation as a failure to be resilient, a deviation from the expected trajectory of struggle, therapy, and eventual recovery. Taves subverts this expectation by refusing to offer a restitution narrative. Instead, she portrays Alfreda's suffering as incommensurable with the neoliberal logic of wellness and productivity. Her psychiatric treatment becomes another site of paternalism and control, with doctors infantilizing her refusal to bounce back. As I argue in a previous article, the novel critiques the resilience imperative in clinical settings, revealing how moral worth is increasingly tied to the ability to endure and optimize under capitalism. Yolande's eventual decision to support her sister's assisted suicide signals a profound act of relational care, decentering individual survival in favor of interdependence and compassion. And finally, Jean-Christophe Grel's Tatooine, though less explicitly political, also offers a powerful critique of the neoliberal valorization of resilience through its portrayal of chronic illness. The novel follows an unnamed narrator living with cystic fibrosis, whose daily life is marked by fatigue, bureaucracy, and precarious hope. Rather than present his endurance as heroic, Rel foregrounds the mundane, the repetitive, and often absurd aspects of illness. The narrator's daydreams of life on Tatooine, the fictional planet from Star Wars, underscore his desire to escape not only disease but also the expectations placed upon him to remain productive and positive. In Tatooine, resilience is not about transformation or triumph, but about surviving in spite of exhaustion and sometimes in resistance to the demand to get better. The novel's quiet defiance lies in its refusal to frame illness as a temporary detour from normal life. Instead, it invites readers to consider a form of resilience that makes space for rest, withdrawal, and unheroic persistence, a theme that deeply resonates with Basileur's call for more complex and less linear resilience narratives. In conclusion, contemporary Canadian fiction challenges dominant narratives of resilience by revealing its deep entanglements with health and well being. As Fraile Marcos notes, resilience has become a culturally embedded framework for navigating adversity, often presented as both descriptive and prescriptive. Yet, as the authors examined here show, resilience is never neutral. It is shaped by political, ecological, and epistemological forces that determine who is expected to be resilient and under what conditions. Writers like Maracle, Taves, Rell, and King explore resilience not as a universal virtue, but as a situated process rooted in specific histories and relationships. Their works expose the tension between resilience as adaptation and resilience as resistance, especially in contexts marked by colonialism, illness, and systemic injustice. This shift has profound implications for how we understand health and well being. Rather than seeing health as the absence of disease or well being as personal fulfillment, these texts frame both as relational achievements shaped by justice, recognition, and care. Taves reimagines well being not as a recovery but as compassion, where Yolanda's support for her sister's suicide resists the medical pathologization of non-compliance. Miracle envisions well being as collective healing rooted in land sovereignty and the colonial practice, while Rel's Tatooine critiques the burden of neoliberal resilience by embracing refusal, offering an alternative to recovery narrative that demand inspiration from the sick. Ultimately, these narratives ask us to rethink resilience itself, not as a requirement for dignity or a mandate to improve, but as a contested history that reveals the uneven pressures placed upon vulnerable lives. In doing so, I claim Canadian fiction opens space for alternative ways of enduring, caring, and imagining what it means to live otherwise. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed my paper, and I look forward to discussing in the comments section. Thank you very much.